The question before time. Why would Jesus pray to God if he was God? It sounds like a paradox, maybe even a contradiction. A divine being bowing his knees? The eternal word whispering into the silence of heaven as if someone else was listening? For centuries, theologians have debated it. Some avoid the question. Others drown it in doctrine. But the truth doesn't live in the noise of arguments. It lives in the quiet before words began. To understand why Jesus prayed, we have to peel back everything: miracles, sermons, crosses, and go further. Past Bethlehem, past the angels' songs, past even the first chapter of Genesis. We must go to the place where time was still unborn, where silence wasn't empty, it was full of presence. There, before stars were scattered across the void, before humanity ever inhaled, there was a communion, unbreakable, undivided, glorious. The Son didn't begin in a manger. He didn't begin at all. He was. And in that eternal being, there was a relationship deeper than speech, older than time, stronger than death. This isn't just about Jesus praying. It's about what prayer truly is. And to answer the question, why God prays, we must step into the mystery of a love so ancient, it still echoes through every breath we take. What do you think Jesus was feeling when he prayed in Gethsemane? The voice that preceded creation. In the beginning, there was no beginning, only presence. Before light was separated from darkness, before oceans obeyed boundaries, before the first prayer ever rose from human lips, there was a voice. Not a sound as we know it, but a being who was the Word. He existed not beside God, but within him. Not beneath, but face to face, eternally reflected in glory. In the beginning was the Word, John would later write, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That verse is not poetry. It is reality unveiled. Jesus didn't come into existence in Bethlehem. He stepped into visibility. What the world saw in the manger was not a new life, but ancient life made touchable. The Word that spoke galaxies into motion now curled his fingers around the dust he once formed. But even before that, before time had any measurement, he was already in communion. Not alone, not waiting, not silent. The relationship between the Father and the Son was never a transaction. It was a current, flowing back and forth, glory given and received, joy mirrored, purpose shared. It wasn't static. It was movement, rhythm, fire that never burned out. This wasn't divine bureaucracy. It was intimacy, raw, radiant, and unending. We think of prayer as asking, but for the Son, prayer was remembering, returning, dwelling. Jesus didn't pray because he lacked. He prayed because he belonged to a communion that predates the cosmos. A bond so perfect it needed no language, yet chose to speak anyway. When he prayed on earth, he wasn't introducing something new. He was revealing what always was. A conversation older than time, still echoing, still alive. This is where prayer begins, not with need, but with love. When eternity took a breath. No thunder, no smoke, no divine parade. When God stepped into time, he did not crash through the atmosphere. He arrived the way a sigh enters a room, quiet, invisible, but heavy with purpose. The eternal Son clothed himself in flesh, not as a disguise, not as theater, but as an offering. The hands that once held the stars now gripped the edge of a feeding trough. The breath that had no beginning now tasted air and cold in the sin of livestock. He entered the fragile world of hunger and fatigue. He learned the sound of his mother's voice. He learned pain, not in theory, but in bone. But here is the mystery. He did not surrender his divinity. He suspended his rights. He laid aside the brilliance that once lit up heaven, not because he was forced to, but because love always chooses to descend before it rises. This moment, this incarnation, is not just a holy event. It is a declaration. God does not stay distant. He walks into the limitation of skin and blood and human exhaustion. And in doing so, he teaches us something sacred. Prayer is not for the desperate, it is for the devoted. Jesus, in all his eternal authority, chose dependence. Not because he was weak, but because he wanted to live every moment connected to the Father. His prayers were not reminders of divine protocol. They were daily alignments. In every step, every silence, every rising sun, he sought the Father. Not as ritual, but as rhythm. Luke tells us that Jesus often withdrew to desolate places to pray, not to escape people, but to remember who he was when the crowds forgot. His solitude was not absence, it was anchoring. And in those secret hours, the Son wasn't rediscovering his mission. He was resting in the relationship that gave the mission meaning. This is where the fabric of eternity stretched into the skin of time. This is where God taught us that true strength kneels, that power listens, that even the one who never sinned still prayed. He did not pray to perform. He prayed because it was home. The weight of knees on earth. He could have commanded legions. He could have spoken reality into submission. And yet, he knelt. Not once, not as a gesture, but as a way of life. Jesus prayed not because he forgot who he was, but because he fully remembered. And remembering meant returning again and again to the place where the Father's voice drowned out every other. Prayer was not an obligation for him. It was oxygen. When others saw him step away, they might have assumed he was avoiding responsibility. But he was stepping into the furnace where purpose is reforged. Even in his greatest moments of human triumph, healing the sick, feeding thousands, walking on water, Jesus didn't cling to applause. He disappeared into mountains, into gardens, into stillness, because even miracles do not sustain the soul. Only communion does. When he prayed, it wasn't a script. It was a surrender. And it was in those moments that he made decisions not just as a teacher, but as a son. Before he chose the 12, he prayed. Before he faced the cross, he prayed. When grief struck, he lifted his voice, not in panic, but in honesty. At the tomb of Lazarus, he didn't demand resurrection. He gave thanks before the miracle came. That's the kind of prayer that shapes the earth, prayer that doesn't start with fear but with trust. Jesus didn't pray for performance. He prayed because the presence of the Father was his foundation. He wasn't seeking strength. He was returning to the well he never left. And it's here that we must rethink everything. Because if the Son of God, fully divine, fully knowing, still found it necessary to fall to his knees, what makes us think we can stand without doing the same? We've made prayer into a ritual, a backup plan, a last resort. He made it into breath. He showed us that prayer is not about convincing heaven to act. It's about refusing to live disconnected from it. It is not a request form. It is a relationship. And in that relationship, Jesus didn't hide his weariness. He brought it with him, not because he was weak, but because trust is strongest when it doesn't edit itself. The Son who sustained the universe still chose to rise before sunrise and disappear into unmarked places, not to be seen, but to be still. And each time he returned from prayer, he returned clearer, calmer, rooted. Prayer was not something he added to life. It was his life. The garden where heaven trembled. There was no thunder that night, no angel choir, just olive trees, soil, and the kind of silence that aches in the chest. Jesus walked into Gethsemane, not as a symbol, not as a prophet in performance, but as a man carrying the weight of everything that ever broke humanity. His friends couldn't see it. They were weary, distracted, but he felt it like lead in his lungs. This was the place where heaven didn't speak, the place where eternity's pulse slowed to match the tremor in his voice. And still, he knelt. He had prayed many times before on mountaintops, before crowds awoke, in hidden corners of solitude. But this prayer was different. This one came not from strength, but from surrender so absolute it shook the stars. "My soul is overwhelmed with sorrow," he said, "even to the point of death." These were not metaphors. They were confessions of a soul unraveling, not with panic, but with purpose. And then came the words, whispered into the atmosphere that dared not respond. "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me, yet not as I will, but as you will." In that breath, the entire universe held still, because this was not divine theater. This was the collision of two wills, the perfect will of God and the fully human will of a son who could feel every thread of dread, every flash of pain yet to come. It wasn't a lack of faith. It was the presence of agony. He prayed again, then again. Luke tells us his sweat fell like drops of blood to the ground. That is not poetic exaggeration. That is what it looks like when the cost of redemption reaches the surface of skin. In heaven? Heaven remained still, not absent, but still. The silence wasn't punishment. It was witness. No angel interrupted. No voice declared, "This is my son." Only the slow cracking of the world's deepest fault line, the moment when obedience chose to stay instead of flee. The Son did not run. He didn't argue. He didn't numb himself to the road ahead. He simply prayed until his feet could carry what his soul had already surrendered. He stood, not lighter, but resolved. The cup would not pass, but he would not pass it to someone else. And so he rose, not with applause, but with resolve. not with certainty of outcome, but with certainty of purpose. Because some prayers do not change the path, they change the person walking it. Blood between two thieves. The sky didn't crack open, it darkened. By noon, what should have been sunlight turned heavy, like a veil had been thrown over creation. The one who once called light out of nothing now hung between earth and sky, blood tracing the shape of his ribs, breath drawing shorter with each word. And still, he prayed, not for escape, not for vengeance, but for them. Father, forgive them. They do not know what they're doing. These were not words of resignation. They were rebellion against hatred, against the logic of retaliation, against everything in us that demands fairness over mercy. He was not praying from a place of comfort, but from a splintered beam, wrists nailed through nerve, lungs compressing under the slow suffocation of crucifixion. Yet his first cry was forgiveness, not for himself, for us. He looked to the side and found, even then, a soul barely holding on. A thief, gasping out a question not of escape, but of remembrance. And Jesus, in the middle of his own death, gave him a promise. Today, you will be with me in paradise. The prayer continued, not as words now, but as presence, as offering, as steadfastness when every heartbeat tried to betray him. And then, the deepest wound, one no whip could cause. My God, why have you forsaken me? This wasn't loss of belief. It was full immersion into the experience of abandonment. He who had always known union now drank the silence we all fear. Not because the Father had stopped loving him, but because the weight of every sin ever committed stood between them for that moment. He became what we were, so we could become what he is. He prayed again, not for answers, but to return. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And with that, the world shifted. The veil tore, not from bottom to top, but from the heights of heaven downward. God saying, no more distance. Because the prayer of the Son didn't end with death. It finished the separation. It built the bridge. It broke the silence. This was not just sacrifice. It was communion, sealed in blood, between two thieves, one cross, and a love no grave could hold. The voice that never went silent. The tomb was sealed, stone against stone, soldiers stationed, silence installed like a sentence. But silence does not mean absence, and absence does not mean defeat. Because even when his body lay motionless, the voice of the Son did not cease. Death might pause breath, but it cannot mute eternity. He rose, not just in defiance of mortality, but in fulfillment of every word he had ever spoken in prayer. And when he walked out of that grave, he didn't leave prayer behind. He brought it with him, into every locked room, every trembling heart, every broken disciple who thought the story had ended. He appeared not with fanfare, but with familiarity. And still, he prayed. Over meals, in blessings, in quiet moments where eyes met eyes and shame met grace. And even then, the prayers were never for himself. They were for them, for us. Because resurrection didn't end his intercession. It expanded it. He ascended not to retreat, but to reign. And from the right hand of the Father, he still speaks, not in sermons now, but in advocacy, in mercy, in unrelenting compassion that watches over every faltering heart. He always lives to intercede, Scripture says, not as a memory, not as metaphor, but as function, as identity. Jesus didn't retire from prayer. He enthroned it. Even now, when words escape us, when prayers feel dull or lost, when silence returns and we wonder if heaven hears, he is still speaking, not in desperation, but in certainty, not begging for scraps of grace, but presenting his scars as proof that grace has already been paid in full. He prays because he knows. He intercedes not out of duty, but out of familiarity. Every ache we carry, he has carried. Every shadow we fear, he has walked through. And with every breath, he reminds the Father, this one, I know, I love, I died for. His voice never went silent. It just moved to a higher place. The prayer that carries your name. Somewhere between Gethsemane and glory, he whispered your name. Not in general, not as part of a crowd. Personally, specifically, as someone seen, through every failure, every doubt, every late-night silence where you wondered if God still listens. He does. Because the one who once wept in a garden now reigns in heaven, and he still prays, still intercedes, still carries your name with the same fire that carried the cross. This isn't religion. It's rescue. You don't have to perform to be heard. You don't have to be flawless to be known. His prayer is not conditional, it is constant. And it began long before you ever thought to speak. When your voice shakes, when your faith thins, when all you can offer are broken sentences and dry eyes, he fills in the silence. Because he knows your need before you even recognize it. And yet, he still invites you to speak. Not because he needs your words, but because you need his presence. Prayer was never meant to be a formula. It was always meant to be a reunion, a returning, a remembering of who you are and whose you are. And today, if your heart is stirring, even just a little, that's not emotion. That's invitation. The Son is still praying, and in his prayer is you. If this touched your heart, help share this. Like, comment, subscribe, not for numbers, but so this message reaches someone else who needs it.